live! Hello, everyone, and welcome to Samanthropolitics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. We have a great show coming up.
On the military for the genocide against the Rohingya. So
as these poor people are being attacked, people are hiding in their offices. You guys saw a guest.
We're going to be talking about Burma and Russia today, but just a quick U.S. Native American Secretary of the Interior. Now, this is really monumental because
I'm Samantha Karlin, your host of Samanthropolitics, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
If you could show the audience where Iran is on the globe. Awesome. So Iran, that's going to be the crux of our show today. So the relationship between the U.S. and Iran has been pretty complicated and troubled. It started in the 1950s when the U.S. supported a coup to overthrow the then prime minister. And we installed a puppet minister who was supportive of the Shah, who was our ally. If you'll notice in the slideshow, one of the images is an American flag burning in Iran. Not good. This image is from 2017. We also sold lots of arms to the Shah.
Unemployment, there were poor living conditions, pay cuts, and disillusionment with the regime were some issues that came up that caused people to rise up. There had been an increase of wealth in the country and the creation of a middle class due to riches in oil, but a lot of the oil also went into the pocket of the Shah's people, and Western oil companies. The West and the US, surprise, surprise, were aligned with the Shah, and we wanted him to stay in power. Well, because of the issues that were happening within the country, people rose up against the Shah and demanded a new style of government. It's really important to point out that there are some scholars that will say that religiosity was the driving force behind the revolution, that, they wanted an all the people wanted an Islamic republic. They were angered by the lack of religion. There were some people that were like that, but ultimately that really wasn't the main reason. It was essentially disillusionment, pay cuts, all sorts of things that traditionally foment revolutions in all areas of the world. The majority of Sunnis were pushed to the side by the minority, the Shiites, towards the end of the revolution. The Shiites are more extreme, and this changed the political character within the country. And it also led to the formation of Hezbollah and fomented a lot of Islamic extremism in the region that we see today, including ISIS. You might remember that we put the Islamic Revolutionary Guard on the terrorist watch list in 1984. And Iran and U.S. relations have been very tense since the Shah was deposed. Now, under the Shah, what about women? Women didn't feel as if they were able to fully participate underneath the Shah. And Ayatollah Khomeini, who was an exiled leader that kind of took the face of the Iranian Revolution, and other people said, hey, we want to give you equal rights. We want to make you parts of society. They coaxed women in believing that if they really participated in the revolution and they deposed the Shah and there was a new government, that Iranian women were going to have far more rights than they already did, which is why a lot of the Iranian women were leading activists within the Iranian Revolution. It was really their coming to age of activism. It was very cold during the revolution, so there were a lot of shops and such that were closed. There were curfews. So women actually held a lot of activist meetings within the home. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, he essentially, I think, was playing lip service to all of the rights that he wanted women to have, because he saw that they were a large mobilizing force of the Iranian Revolution. And therefore, he wanted to promise them the world. I don't think he actually meant it. So in 1978, from exile, he said, Islam wants to safeguard women's nobility. It wishes to make her a serious and efficient human being. So this is in 1978 from exile, shortly before the revolution. He was also asked about the role of women in Islamic government. And he said, Women have taken part in the recent struggle in Iran to the same degree as the men, he said on January 23rd, 1979. This is a week before he returns to Tehran. We will give women every kind of freedom. So he's painting this picture for women that they're going to be a central part of society, that they're going to have all of these rights. Now, once he came into power and he received a lifetime term after being appointed by a panel of 88 clerics and became the supreme leader of Iran, which is a name that cracks me up, he then became a hardliner on religious issues, including women's rights, enforcing the hijab in 1981. And he made sure that Allah Khamenei became his successor. So you could see in this image of this, magazine from the 1970s that Iranian women didn't wear hijabs. They had their hair down. They wore clothes that were whatever you want to call them. Some might say suggestive. I would say normal. They wore normal clothes. They were not done in hijabs. They were very much open and, hair down. This might remind you of another society which has kind of gone backwards in times with women's rights, Afghanistan, and the images we're seeing now of Afghan women kind of going backwards with the same type of repressive, theocratic government that's now taking place in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Well, Allah Khamenei took over in 1989.
He also fostered the evolution of Iran from a pro-West monarchy to an anti-West Islamic theocracy. This was also a period where many Jews, non-Muslims, or people that suddenly became oppressed because they weren't religious enough, fled Iran, came to America and to other places, no longer safe within the country. Movie, this was a real plot that was hatched by an FBI agent. I highly recommend Argo, a really, really cool movie and documentation of history. Carter's inability to solve the crisis beforehand also was part of what led to Reagan's victory. Okay, another big thing that happened between the US and Iran that has been bad in terms of our military relationship was that Iran was backing militias in Lebanon in 1984, Shiite militias, which were believed to have been, they called themselves like the Islamic Front, but they were actually linked to, it looked like Hezbollah, which we see as a terrorist group. Okay, so that's important for this. They then bombed a Marine barracks in Lebanon, in Beirut. It's known as the Beirut bombings, killing all 241 Marines in a single blast. Now, this was the largest single-day death toll for the U.S. Armed Forces since the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. So this was a big deal, especially because at the point the U.S. military was there as peacekeepers in Lebanon during the Lebanese kind of civil war that was happening. So this also, again, remember Iran was supporting, was backing Shiite militias that were believed to be linked to Hezbollah. This also led the State Department to designate Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism in 1984. So that's where that comes from. And I think that that's a really important moment to know, because that's when we were like, okay, Iran is actively aiding terrorism, at least when the US government decided that that was the case. You also may have heard of the Iran-Contra scandal, which happened under Reagan in the 1980s. Really interesting and super freaking weird, and so many countries involved. So under Reagan, even though we had an arms embargo with Iran, we were selling weapons to Iran because we were trying to secure the release of Americans held hostage by Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is the weirdest part to me. That money went into a kind of secret slush fund where, because we didn't want people to know that we were selling weapons to Iran, because that was technically against our own rules. And then this slush fund was then used to fund, are you ready for this? The right-wing Contra groups that were fighting the Sandinista government, which was a communist government in Nicaragua. What a multinational effort. This ended up coming out and was a international embarrassment for the United States. So that was the Iran-Contra scandal. In 1988, an Iranian mine almost sinks an American frigate in the Strait of Hormuz. I didn't know about this. The U.S. Navy shot down an Iranian passenger jet. We were coming after that we thought that it was a fighter jet, and we killed all 290 people on board, which were just civilians that were on a plane, and our military basically murdered them. It's not good. Not good. In 1998, Madeleine Albright, who was an amazing Secretary of State, brought about a mini detente, and she finally recognized the role of the US in engineering that coup in the 1950s. And I think it's so important because these historical grievances can come just from knowing, okay, your country screwed us over and you've never admitted it or you've never apologized. And just doing that apology or recognition can be a really, really important way to kind of shift foreign policy with a country. In 2001, when we invaded Iraq, we had the Bonn Agreement. And this is because the US and Iran both hated the Taliban. And so this agreement was actually supposed to be about jointly defeating the Taliban. Well, it all spirals into hell and back again when George Bush's State of the Union, remember that famous axis of evil speech? Well, who did he put in the axis of evil? North Korea, Iraq, and you guessed it, Iran. This was not a smart move if we ever wanted to thaw relations with Iran, putting them in this axis of evil category. Not good, at which point they stopped working with us in terms of trying to defeat the Taliban. So they reversed course and they started to sponsor local Shiite militias in Iraq to kill American troops, which they did kill hundreds of American troops. Now, then Iran decides that it wants to develop nuclear weapons. This was obviously problematic for the entire international community, not just the US. In 2013 was the initial nuclear agreement in exchange for lifting sanctions in Iran. In 2015, we finally came about the Iran deal, or the JCPOA. This is what I love about government, these like fancy titles that are slightly ridiculous. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Really great name, so catchy. That's why no one talks about it as a joint comprehensive plan of action. You can't even say it. It's like 5 times fast. So this was the P5+1 Iran and the EU reached an agreement. And a big piece of the Iran deal was lifting sanctions sanctions relief in order for Iran, who then agreed to dismantle and redesign its nuclear reactor and limiting uranium enrichment. So this was a really seen as a very monumental deal in United States foreign policy, reaching this Iran deal with all of these signatories. I mean, China and Russia were in on this too. They usually don't agree on anything with the United States and Germany and France. So what did Donald Trump do? Donald Trump decides to pull out of the Iran deal. Why? Literally just because it was done under the Obama administration. If anything said, I swear if Obama had eaten Cheerios every morning and done a Cheerios commercial, he would have outlawed Cheerios. He just didn't want anything to do with anything that Obama had done. So he withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and swore to put something in his place and didn't. And instead, he imposed even harsher sanctions on the country, which have plunged the country into a deep recession. This is startling. Since the spring of 2018, the Iranian rial has lost 68% of its value. Can you imagine if the US dollar lost 68% and $1 was now worth, 22 cents? Or no, excuse me, 32 cents? Unbelievable. Trump also designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is part of the Iranian army, a foreign terrorist organization. We had never designated part of another country's government as a foreign terrorist organization.
And when Ayatollah Khomeini died, and I know it's a little confusing, they sound very similar. They are two different men, but equally repressive. Allah Khomeini, so if you think about what the Ayatollah Khomeini said in 1979, and now Allah Khomeini says in 2014, he says, one of the greatest mistakes of Western thoughts about the issues of women is this sexual equality. Justice is a legitimate concept, but equality is sometimes legitimate and sometimes illegitimate. Why should we separate people who have been built for a particular domain, so he's talking about women here, in terms of one's natural makeup, whether physical or emotional, from that particular domain and drag her towards another domain, which Allah the Exalted has built for another makeup? Why should we do this? What reason do we have for doing this? What kind of sympathy is this? Why should women be entrusted with carrying out male tasks? What kind of honor is to have women carry out male tasks? I am sorry that women and ladies themselves show sensitivity over this issue. So we can see how dramatically we came from 1979 and the promises of women having equal freedoms to all of a sudden saying that women should not be doing male tasks. And then it almost feels patronizing of like, oh, well, this isn't their natural role in society. They should be in the home.
The US killed Qasem Soleimani, who was commander of the IRGC's elite force, in a drone strike. In addition to Israel having had an election for a new president, so did Iran. So Rouhani could not run. He's the current president of Iran because he had already served 2 consecutive terms in office. So who won? Ibrahim Raisi of the Combatant Clergy Association Party. That name is just crazy to me. What's so wild about this was that, did he really win? Because people boycotted the election. So basically what happened was they ruled out any moderates that were put forward to run, basically ensuring that this was a rigged election regardless. So what happened? All the moderates came out and said, don't vote, or all the leftists said, don't vote. There were also journalists that were threatened for writing about candidates. So it was the lowest voter turnout in the country's history, Democratic history, 48%. So why is Raisi so controversial? Well, he was apparently one of 4 judges who in the 80s, he oversaw the execution of thousands of members of Iranian political prisoners, which included women and children. He also has a history of anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. There's something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was basically this book that was written years ago that says that the Jews are trying to dominate the world. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we're not. There is no Jewish conspiracy to dominate the globe. And he was really instrumental in spreading the propaganda of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with the foundation that he was involved in. So pretty worrying for Jewish people. A second piece of big news for Iran, which was breaking news this week, is that the U.S. just carried out another round of airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. It was in response to drone attacks that were perpetrated by Shia Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria on American bases in Iraq and Syria. This has been going on for quite some time now. And, the Iranian-backed militias originally were in Iraq and Syria to fight ISIS, so the US didn't care about them as much. And then once ISIS was quote unquote gone or had dissipated, all of a sudden the Iranian-backed militias were targeting us. The other thing that's interesting about this is that Iran won't directly admit that they're sponsoring these militia groups, but everybody kind of knows that they're getting funding and military equipment from Iran. So it's kind of like we're fighting a proxy war with Iran, but also just fighting a war with Iran with these Iranian-backed militias. But basically, President Biden decided, if you're going to be bombing our troops, we are going to retaliate against you. He also fostered the evolution of Iran from a pro-West monarchy to an anti-West Islamic theocracy. This was also a period where many Jews, non-Muslims, or people that suddenly became oppressed because they weren't religious enough, fled Iran, came to America and to other places, no longer safe within the country.
So you can see how the deterioration of women's rights has happened. So I think that's really important to put into context what is now happening today. Zach, you can play that slideshow, which you've probably have heard, the death of Mahsa Amini, who has now become the face of the protests in Iran. She was a 22-year-old girl who was Kurdish, was in Tehran. She was actually wearing her hijab, but she was wearing it improperly. It wasn't covering enough of her hair or whatever garbage they made up about it. And the morality police, which have been around to enforce this Islamic theocracy that's been in place since 1979, took her into custody. And it's unclear what exactly happened. They, of course, say that she had a heart attack, but it's pretty clear that she was beaten. Her family says she may have been banged against a police vehicle, and she ended up dying in the hospital 4 days after she was taken into custody by the morality police. This has sparked absolute outrage within the country with women. And I think it's important here, too. It's not just women, that women and men alongside them and millennials have taken to the streets, burning their hijabs, cutting their hair publicly, chanting women life freedom, death to the dictator, death to Khamenei. The protests are now all over the country, spanning 31 provinces of Iran and over 80 cities and towns. The Iranian government is not too happy about this. So they've been limiting access to the media through disabling the internet. Even just as we were preparing for the show, which is why we were a little late coming on, one of the videos that we wanted to play all of a sudden wasn't accessible on YouTube. And then it was accessible again. So they're really trying their best to block information of this from getting out to media sources, especially Western media. But they've really been unable to do this. When asked, Khamenei blamed the incitement of the protests, and we're going to ask our guest about this, on the US and Israel, saying that these incidents were designed by America, the fake Zionist regime, those who were on the payroll, and traitorous Iranians abroad who helped them. Their main problem is with a strong and independent Iran and the progress of the country. So he's claiming that this is all kind of a hoax by the US and Israel and the Zionists because they don't want Iran to be an independent country. They want to have control over Iran, which is a bunch of BS. He finally came out and said Amini's death broke our hearts. But he's not really taking this seriously. They said they were going to investigate, but sounds like, again, BS. Biden and the US administration has sided with protesters in his speech to the United Nations, and we have imposed sanctions on the country's morality police. We've also been working with Elon Musk to get these Starlink satellites over there, just as we did in Ukraine, to be able for Iranians to have access to the internet. What's happened with regards to these protests? So let's play some of the protests first. So Zach, you can stop that slideshow. So these are schoolgirls protesting. So pretty powerful watching these girls with backpacks who look like they're about 13 protesting and chanting women, life, freedom. We've got, let's see, women taking... And let's look at who these morality police pretty powerful stuff. You can see women being beaten, pushed into vans. You know, these men don't care at all. They are there to exert their power over women and make themselves feel like they're in power and to, you know, put into place religion, which I think in this case is just a means for controlling women. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but the death toll stands at 133 people, according to Iran human rights groups as of yesterday, because the regime has now reacted against the protesters and is indiscriminately shooting into crowds of protesters and taking people into custody.